The US imposes visa bans on Chinese officials in retaliation for Beijing's policies in Hong Kong. The UN and EU have also called for action to defend human rights in China. But will the international pressure lead to change? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Imran Khan. The United States is taking its first steps in response to Beijing's national security law for Hong Kong. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is imposing visa restrictions on Chinese Communist Party leaders. He didn't reveal any names, but he says they're current and former officials believed to be responsible for undermining human rights in Hong Kong. But China says the law is needed to restore order after months of protests that have turned violent at times. It's bypassing Hong Kong's legislature to push through the measure. The law would ban so-called acts of subversion and terrorism and for the first time allow Beijing to set up a security office in the territory. The Chinese embassy in Washington is urging the US to immediately correct its mistake, withdraw the decision, and stop interfering in China's domestic affairs. It adds that no one has the right to make what it calls irresponsible comments on Hong Kong. And it's not just the US expressing concerns. On Friday, a UN human rights panel demanded decisive international measures to protect human rights, citing Hong Kong, as well as abuses against minorities in the territories of Xinjiang and Tibet. European Union leaders raised the same issues with Chinese politicians during their EU-China summit earlier in the week. Mike Pompeo has called on the US and Europe to confront China together.
The United States is not forcing Europe to choose between the free world or China's authoritarian vision. China is making that choice between freedom and democracy. It's tempting for many, particularly in our business communities, who make money in China to say we must calm tensions and simply accept an increasingly belligerent CCP. That's nonsense. I don't accept that argument. There is no compromise between freedom and authoritarianism. I don't want the future to be shaped by the CCP, and I'd wager no one on this call wants that either.
Let's introduce our panel in Beijing. Victor Gao, chairman and professor at Soochow University. In the German city of Leipzig, Adam Ni, director of China Policy Center. And in Singapore, Raffaello Pantucci, senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. A warm welcome to you all. Let me begin in Beijing with you, Victor Gao. A national security law in Hong Kong being put in by China. A security office being placed since the first time that China took over the territory in 1997 from the Brits. This despite assurances to the British that actually Hong Kong would always remain Hong Kong. What's China's justification for this?
Well, Hong Kong will always remain as Hong Kong. The one country, two system will continue up to 2047, and nothing will be changed in Hong Kong. Now, every country has a national security law. The British does have that. The United States have that. What China is doing for Hong Kong now is no more than what the British had in Hong Kong prior to 1997. Just imagine anyone would do anything in Hong Kong prior to 1997, which would threaten the national security interest of British Empire or the British government or the British monarch, for example. No way. It's not possible. The British Hong Kong rulers before 1997 would never tolerate any such threat to the British national security interest. It is the same case for China. We know what Hong Kong has experienced over the past year or even over the past 4 years or so. And I think this national security law is very much targeted against any person, any political force which wants to use Hong Kong as a threat to challenge China's sovereignty over Hong Kong and to challenge the one country, two system principle in Hong Kong.
Let's bring Adam Ni here in Leipzig. Adam, you've heard the justification for the law there, for the security office. What do you think?
Yeah, well, certainly I think think certainly there's an argument that every country has such a law. However, I think in this case it's slightly different. The professor refers to how UK was no different, but we have to remember that UK was a colonial power, and the PRC does not claim to be a colonial power. Instead, claims to be the rightful sovereign of Hong Kong. So it's a very different position that the PRC now occupies. And when we think about one country, two systems, I think of the last decade or so, we have seen the encroachment of Beijing on that system and the changing in definition. I think it was always ambiguous what one country, two systems meant. And increasingly, Beijing is pushing the goalposts. And the latest national security law is an example of that. Under the Sino-British Declaration, as well as the Basic Law of Hong Kong, Hong Kong is guaranteed a high degree of autonomy in different areas that is certainly not available to other cities in the mainland. And we've seen a gradual erosion of that.
Let's bring in Raffaello Pantucci here in Singapore. How much of this is simply that China is actually too big, too powerful to actually listen to anybody? Even by putting visa restrictions on Chinese Communist Party members isn't going to stop it from introducing this law, having the security office, and continuing down the path that it's going down, particularly when it comes to human rights abuses.
It's going to be very difficult to see how the world is going to push back on what China's done beyond the sort of thunder that we've heard. I think the United Kingdom has done a very good and proper thing, which is extend its sort of blanket of protection in terms of offering some, form of citizenship or entry to British BNO holders, sort of holders of special documents, which was sort of the link that continued between Hong Kong and the United Kingdom. But I think the fundamental problem is that from China's perspective, this is not really seen as a foreign policy issue. From China's perspective, Hong Kong is another Chinese city that had this kind of special situation, but ultimately it was a city which is going to be brought, which is going to be, which is part of China. So from their perspective, this is a domestic question. So from that perspective, when you're trying to get a country to change its behavior towards its own citizens within its own territory, you're treading on very difficult ground, because ultimately whatever you're doing is something which is going to be perceived by the leadership as an erosion of its power before its own people. Which makes it very difficult to know how it is you're going to actually change this sort of behavior, especially when you're looking at a power like China, which has, which is now the world's second largest economy, which is, on its way to developing a sort of a substantial military force and is becoming a real power sort of in the world. It's going to be very difficult to see how you're going to get this sort of a power to make the decision to do something which it perceives as being merely, as I think Mr. Gao, Professor Gao, sort of articulated in his comments, the sort of continued normalization of Hong Kong's role as a Chinese city.
Victor Gao, China is becoming a power. It is becoming a very powerful nation. To paraphrase Stanley, the great graphic novelist, with great power comes great responsibility. China surely is getting to the stage where it does have to take seriously the international community.
Absolutely. I think China is one of the countries which actually shows the highest level of respect for the international community, treating all countries, big or small, as equals, treating the United Nations and the other international organizations with high level of respect. China is not manhandling any other country or any other international organizations. And I would say China is a shining example of treating the rest of the world as an equal, even though it has the largest population in the world, even though by PPP, China is already larger than that of the United States. So I would say treating other countries with respect, treating other international organizations with full respect is a must for any country, China included. And I think China will continue to do that going forward. Now, as a sovereign over Hong Kong, China will not tolerate any attempt to use Hong Kong to constitute a threat to China's national security interests. Look at what happened over the past year. You see a lot of anarchy and attack on rule of law, arson, attack on innocent passengers in the streets, for example. And Hong Kong, as a democracy, has full legal protection for lawful protests and demonstrations. But many of these things are not lawful protests or demonstrations. They are illegal. And if you do the investigation, you will realize that there are foreign forces behind it, aiding and abetting or setting more fire to this political unrest in Hong Kong. This is exactly what this national security law is aimed about. I think the people who will be targeted by the national security law will be very, very small, because the majority of the people in Hong Kong have no interest in challenging China's sovereignty over Hong Kong, or overthrowing the Communist Party of China, or seriously undermining the one country, two system in Hong Kong.
Raffaello Pantucci, I see you shaking your head there in disagreement. Tell me what you think.
Well, I think it's, I think this narrative that we've heard frequently from Beijing, that there are foreign forces stirring this problem up in Hong Kong, I think is exactly part of the problem, because I don't think that is the root of what we're seeing in Hong Kong. What we're seeing in Hong Kong is a public that is very concerned about what is going to happen to them, and is very concerned about Beijing's continuing expressions of power over them. Yes, it is true, it is not everybody in Hong Kong. There are people in Hong Kong who agree with what Beijing is doing. But there is a substantial minority, majority, it's very difficult to tell exactly what the numbers are, who are really unhappy and very concerned. And that is what we're seeing in the protests on the street. And it's very concerning when we hear voices from Beijing blaming this on foreigners. Because it sort of misses the point that you have got a population in Hong Kong who are really concerned about their future, about what's going to happen to them. And they're the ones who are really stirring these protests on. Now, of course, there are some elements within there who are turning to violence, who do need to be dealt with. But the fundamental point of these protests are real articulations of anger and concern about what is going to happen to their country. You just need to go back and look at the peaceful protests we've seen in Hong Kong. I forget exactly when now, but in sort of past year or beyond, to see that many hundreds of thousands of Hong Kongers are really concerned. We saw the first articulations of these protests when when there was a discussion about changing the laws on extradition from Hong Kong. And then we've seen them re-articulated now around the national security law. So there is something really going on here that I think Beijing needs to engage with, and not simply point fingers at foreign forces who they say are stirring these problems up. I think by doing that, you're really sort of missing the point of the root of the problem. And in some way, this is exactly what everyone else is worried about when they look at how Beijing articulates this particular legislation. Because as others who correctly pointed out, it makes sense to have some sort of a national security legislation in much the same way as it makes sense to have some sort of an extradition law. You don't want to have a place where, rapists and murderers can go and hide. Absolutely not. But the point is, the way it's being implemented and the way it's being articulated is clearly something that's of great concern to the public in Hong Kong. And I think that is the issue that needs to be engaged with, rather than, simply pointing to, dark foreign forces that are stirring things up, of which, frankly, there is very little evidence.
Adam Nee, we've heard about human rights abuses by China when it comes to the treatment of the Uyghurs, the Uyghur Muslims, when it comes to internet restrictions, attacks on journalists, and the list goes on and on. So, of course, there is concern from people, for example, in Hong Kong, that could start taking place within the territory itself. China has always said that these are internal issues, that this is about the internal domestic politics. But when it does come to human rights abuses by the Chinese state, how concerned are you?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, me as well as the international community is increasingly concerned about the widespread human rights abuses in China, especially in relation to the internment camps in Xinjiang. These are widespread, well-documented abuses of human rights. Of course, Beijing sees that as a domestic issue, but that's increasingly building ill will among the international community. And I think, rightly so, how Beijing acts internally is going to, at some stage, reflected in its international actions. And I think we should be gravely concerned about what is happening in China in terms of human rights.
Victor Gao, earlier you talked about respect for nations, that China has respect for other nations. Other nations are now increasingly becoming very critical of China's foreign policy, China's human rights record. And now Mike Pompeo has taken this step to ban certain Chinese Communist Party members. What does that do to the Chinese-America relationship?
Well, this is very unfortunate, and I think it's very ironic, as one editor in China well said today. He said at this particular time when the COVID-19 pandemic is raging and wreaking havoc in the United States, who wants to go to the United States? So I think he's really barking at the wrong tree. Now, he's talking about boycotting Chinese people or Chinese officials to go to the United States. The Communist Party of China, the ruling party of China, has a membership almost 90 million people, including all the important government officials. Does he really want to ban all the members of the Communist Party of China from going to the United States? That's not realistic. Now, what does he really expect? Does he really expect the Chinese authorities ban Pompeo himself from visiting China anymore? No, this kind of manhandling is not helping the United States and is not going to change the position of China over this national security law in Hong Kong. The national security law is carved in stone and it's going to be implemented. And anyone who wants to use Hong Kong as a platform to challenge and threaten China's national security will be dealt with as such, period. That's the end of the story. So you need to accept this megatrend and deal with China as it is. This is not showing disrespect to the United States. This is exactly how China and the United States need to deal with each other. There are people in Washington who still indulging fantasies that they can do things to hold China to the ground without consequences. Those days are gone forever. The United States need to give China minimum equal treatment and respect. Otherwise, consequences will attach to these manhandling tactics of the United States.
Rafaela, you've heard some very strong words there from Victor Gao. It is seemingly a defiant stance from Beijing. They're not going to listen. What do you think? How do you make China listen? How do you make China listen to legitimate international concerns?
Well, I think, there is something to the fact that we are dealing with a power here which is very strong and becoming stronger and has clearly got a mood at the moment which is very confrontational. And very much not minded to stand down to any sort of adversaries. And actually, if we look at what's been happening with China and some of its neighbors over the past few months, for example, the clashes with India, for example, some of the war of rhetoric that we've seen with Kazakhstan, some of the smaller level clashes we've seen with Russia, as well, of course, as all the ones happening on China's seas with Hong Kong, with Taiwan, with Japan, we're seeing a China which is really sort of seeming willing to pick fights all over the place. And it's not entirely clear to me why this sort of mood has taken off in Beijing. But I think what it does reflect is the fact that you've got a power at the moment that feels very confident of itself and there's lashing out in all directions. Now, I think the one element that I would impress upon, colleagues and friends in Beijing to remember is that, you may dismiss some of these concerns that people have about, treatment of domestic populations as, interference in your affairs. But I think the point that I think Adam sort of hinted towards was that, if the way the world will look at this is they will say, well, if the country is willing to treat its own people like this, how is it going to treat the rest of us? Already we can see this narrative quite dominant with the United States. We look at the protests in the United States and we see what reflection that has on the United States on the global stage. So I think that's an important element that China forgets, is that, how you articulate yourself to yourself, how you express yourself to your own people is reflected, especially when you get to the stage of being a large power. Now, to your specific question about what the world can kind of do about some of these issues within China, it is very challenging. I think where we have seen evidence of possible shifts in Chinese behavior is often when we see things dealt with at a very sort of micro-individual level. So where we've seen the kind of international community, lobby very specifically about certain individuals, where we've seen specific companies being pressured to sort of withdraw, we have seen some evidence of sort of movement. But it is very difficult here. And it is going to be even harder, I think, to get China to change its behavior as we see it going forwards. But I think the key thing from everyone's perspective is everyone would like to see a China that is behaving in a way on the world stage that is kind of reflective of the clearly, great power that is rising to be. And at the moment, I think to a lot of people around the world, there is a great deal of concern about the sort of power that we're seeing China articulating itself as. And that, I think, is the root of a lot of the clashes. Sorry.
Adam Need, what do you think? Do you think China will ever become a responsible player, like in the way that Rafael has described?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by responsible player. I mean, there's certainly the narratives about China being a responsive stakeholder has been, partly driving the shift in U.S. policy. The idea, or rather, the reconstruction of the history that, well, the U.S. had engaged China on the basis that China was going to liberalize and become a responsible power. And now that they found out that Chinese Communist Party had no intention of becoming the kind of power that the Americans wanted it to be, I think that kind of narrative, as much as ahistorical as that is driving U.S. policy towards China, and indeed rising anxieties in a lot of different places in the world about a China that is backsliding in terms of its protection for human rights and its political system towards a more illiberal direction under Xi. A China that is increasingly becoming more powerful and is willing to assert its interest on the international stage, including with coercive tools. So, of course, that's going to create worries around different countries around the world. And I think increasingly, as we've talked about before, China has to recognize that there are genuine grievances both domestically, so in this case in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang and other places, but as well as internationally among its international partners and competitors about a whole range of issues. And China has to be pragmatic about these international concerns and actually deal with them instead of seeing it through the lens of trying to contain China per se.
I want to ask all three of you the same question. I'm going to begin in Beijing with Victor Gao. How much of this is actually because the US as a superpower is in decline? We are seeing the rise of Russia. We are seeing the rise of China. And given that China believes that the US is in decline, it can simply do what it wants. Is that a factor in Beijing's thinking?
I think China and the United States need to get along, whether when China was much smaller than the United States, whether now China is already larger than the United States in terms of purchasing power parity, but China will be larger than the United States in about 10 years' time by official exchange rate calculation. Or whether...
Sorry, I'm just going to have to disturb you there because I do want to get to our other guests and we are running out of time. So let me begin with Adam Nee. Do you think a lot of this is to do with the fact that America has declined as a superpower?
Yeah, I think some of it has to do with American decline. There is a change in the relativities of power in the way that now China is more confident about its place in the world and the ability of it to get its way. So on the one hand, you have a rising China. On the other hand, you have a declining United States. And it's in that uncertain period of transition, of flux, that I think is most dangerous.
Rafael, what are your thoughts?
Nature abhors a vacuum, and I think that's what we've seen happening in the past few years with the United States sort of essentially removing itself from the world stage. You've created a situation with no great power sitting at its core. And within that system, we've seen all sorts of powers moving in to try to fill that vacuum in their different ways. I think what's worrisome to me is that it's not clear to me that anyone can actually fill that vacuum, which is why we're in such a dangerous moment now, where we have all these powers that are clearly seeing there's a moment for them to sort of bump into this place, but none of them are actually able to do it. And so as a result, we get lashing out in all directions, we get clashes, we get miscommunications and misunderstandings, and we get this very chaotic international situation that we're currently stuck in.
Thanks for an incredibly interesting conversation. That was Victor Gao, Adam Nee, and Rafael Pantucci. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.